Genesis had always been a dreamer. As a child, she would spend hours gazing out her bedroom window, imagining fantastical worlds and epic adventures far beyond the confines of her small Midwestern town. Now, at 30 years old, she found herself still dreaming, though her fantasies had shifted from magical realms to more practical aspirations of career success and finding true love. She sighed as she stared out the window of her corner office, watching the bustling streets of Chicago below. Genesis had achieved the career success she'd longed for, quickly climbing the corporate ladder to become the youngest executive at her marketing firm. And yet, something was still missing. A sharp knock on her door snapped her out of her reverie. "Come in," she called, swiveling her chair to face the entrance. Thomas poked his head in, an apologetic smile on his handsome face. "Sorry to interrupt, but do you have a minute to go over the Henderson account?" Genesis felt her heart skip a beat, as it always did when Thomas was near. At 35, he was a few years her senior and had been with the company far longer. She'd been instantly drawn to his quick wit, kind eyes, and boyish charm when they first met 2 years ago. Over time, their relationship had evolved from strictly professional to a close friendship. Genesis cherished their easy rapport and inside jokes, even as she longed for something more. "Of course, come on in," she replied with a warm smile. As Thomas settled into the chair across from her desk, Genesis couldn't help but admire the way his blue dress shirt accentuated his broad shoulders. She quickly averted her gaze, reminding herself for the 1,000th time that office romances were strictly forbidden. They spent the next hour poring over campaign strategies and budget projections. Genesis found herself getting lost in Thomas's enthusiasm as he outlined his vision for the project. His passion was infectious, and she soon found herself building on his ideas with her own creative suggestions. "This is brilliant, Jen," Thomas exclaimed, using the nickname he'd given her early in their friendship. "With your marketing expertise and my sales background, we make quite the team." Genesis beamed at the praise, a warm flush creeping up her neck. "We certainly do," she agreed. "I always enjoy collaborating with you, Thomas." A comfortable silence fell between them as they smiled at each other across the desk. Genesis found herself getting lost in Thomas's deep brown eyes, marveling at the tiny flecks of gold hidden within their depths. The moment stretched on a beat too long before Thomas cleared his throat and glanced away. "Well, I should get back to it," he said, gathering up the papers spread across her desk. "Thanks for your help, General. I don't know what I'd do without you." "Anytime," she replied softly, watching as he headed for the door. Just as he was about to leave, Thomas paused and turned back. "Hey, a bunch of us are grabbing drinks after work to celebrate landing the Henderson account. You'll join us, right?" Genesis hesitated. She typically avoided after-work socializing, preferring to maintain professional boundaries, but the hopeful look in Thomas's eyes made it impossible to refuse. "Sure, I'd love to," she found herself saying. Thomas's face lit up. "Great, I'll swing by your office when I'm done for the day, and we can head over together." As the door closed behind him, Genesis slumped back in her chair with a groan. What was she thinking? Spending time with Thomas outside of work would only intensify her growing feelings for him, and yet she couldn't bring herself to regret accepting the invitation. The rest of the afternoon crawled by at an agonizing pace. Genesis found it nearly impossible to focus on her work, her mind constantly drifting to thoughts of Thomas and their impending outing. When 6 o'clock finally rolled around, she was a bundle of nervous energy. A soft knock made her jump. "Ready to go?" Thomas asked, poking his head in once more. Genesis nodded, grabbing her purse and following him out of the office. They chatted easily as they walked the few blocks to the bar, discussing work and sharing amusing anecdotes about their day. Genesis found herself relaxing in Thomas's presence, her earlier nerves melting away. The bar was already crowded when they arrived, filled with the after-work crowd unwinding after a long day. They spotted their co-workers at a large table in the corner and made their way over. Genesis ended up wedged between Thomas and Sarah from accounting, acutely aware of Thomas's thigh pressed against hers in the cramped space. As the night wore on and the drinks flowed freely, Genesis found herself letting loose in a way she rarely did. She laughed at Thomas's jokes, playfully bumping his shoulder when he teased her. Their co-workers gradually trickled out until only Genesis, Thomas, and a few others remained. "Another round?" Thomas suggested, gesturing to Genesis's empty glass. She hesitated, knowing she should call it a night, but the warmth of the alcohol coursing through her veins and Thomas's hopeful expression weakened her resolve. "Sure, why not?" she agreed with a grin. Thomas returned a few minutes later with fresh drinks for them both. As he settled back into his seat, his arm brushed against Genesis's, sending a jolt of electricity through her. She took a large sip of her cocktail, hoping the alcohol would dull the intensity of her reaction to his proximity. "So, Jen," Thomas said, turning to face her more fully, "we've known each other for 2 years now, but I feel like there's still so much I don't know about you. Tell me something I'd be surprised to learn." Genesis pondered the question for a moment, taking another sip of her drink. Well, I'm actually a pretty good singer. I was in a band in college." Thomas's eyebrows shot up. "No way! How did I not know this about you? What kind of music did you play?" "Mostly covers of 90s alternative rock," Genesis admitted with a laugh. "We thought we were very edgy and cool." "I bet you were," Thomas said with a grin. "You'll have to give me a private concert sometime." Genesis felt her cheeks flush at the suggestion. "Maybe after a few more of these," she joked, raising her glass. As the night progressed, Genesis found herself opening up to Thomas in a way she never had before. They swapped stories about their childhoods, their dreams for the future, and their deepest fears. With each revelation, Genesis felt herself falling deeper under Thomas's spell. It wasn't until the bartender called out last call that Genesis realized how late it had gotten. She glanced around, surprised to find the bar had mostly emptied out. Their remaining co-workers had left at some point without her noticing. "I can't believe how late it is," she said, stifling a yawn. "I should probably head home." Thomas nodded, looking equally surprised by the time. "Let me walk you to your car," he offered. "It's pretty late to be out alone." Genesis started to protest that she was perfectly capable of walking herself to the parking garage, but the concern in Thomas's eyes made her reconsider. "That would be nice, thank you," she said instead. They gathered their things and headed out into the cool night air. Genesis shivered slightly, wishing she'd brought a jacket. Without a word, Thomas shrugged off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "Oh, you don't have to," Genesis began to protest. "I insist," Thomas said firmly. "Can't have you catching a cold." Genesis pulled the jacket tighter around herself, inhaling Thomas's familiar scent of sandalwood and citrus. They walked in comfortable silence for a few blocks, their arms occasionally brushing against each other. As they neared the parking garage, Genesis found herself wishing the walk would never end. She'd never felt so comfortable and at ease with someone before. Being with Thomas just felt right in a way she couldn't quite explain. "This is me," she said reluctantly as they reached her car. She turned to face Thomas, suddenly acutely aware of how close they were standing. "Genesis," Thomas said softly, reaching out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered on her cheek, his touch sending shivers down her spine. "I had a really great time tonight." "Me too?" Genesis whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Thomas leaned in slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away. But Genesis found herself moving closer, drawn to him like a magnet. Their lips met in a soft, tentative kiss that quickly deepened as years of pent-up longing poured out. Genesis wound her arms around Thomas's neck, pressing herself against him as the kiss grew more passionate. Thomas's hands settled on her waist, pulling her impossibly closer. It wasn't until they were both breathless that they finally broke apart. "Wow," Thomas said with a dazed smile. "I've wanted to do that for so long." "Me too," Genesis admitted. "But what about the company policy on office relationships?" Thomas's expression grew serious. "I know it's complicated, but Genesis, I care about you too much to let some arbitrary rule stand in our way. We can figure it out together if you're willing to try." Genesis bit her lip, considering his words. She knew pursuing a relationship with Thomas could jeopardize both of their careers, and yet the thought of walking away from this connection they shared was unbearable. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's give it a shot." Thomas's face lit up with joy. He pulled her in for another kiss, this one filled with promise and hope for the future. As Genesis drove home that night, her head was spinning with the events of the evening. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt truly excited about what the future might hold. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of stolen kisses and secret rendezvous. Genesis and Thomas did their best to maintain a professional facade at work, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to hide their growing feelings for each other. They spent their lunch breaks huddled in Genesis's office, sharing takeout and trading shy smiles. After work, they'd often linger in the parking garage, unable to say goodbye. On weekends, they explored the city together, discovering hidden gems and creating new memories. Genesis found herself falling harder for Thomas with each passing day. She loved the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, how he always seemed to know exactly what to say to cheer her up after a stressful day. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen and understood by another person. But as their relationship deepened, so did Genesis's anxiety about keeping it a secret. She hated lying to her co-workers and living in constant fear of being discovered. The stress was starting to take its toll on both of them. One Friday afternoon, Genesis was in the middle of a meeting when her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Meet me on the roof in 10 minutes. It's important." Her heart racing, Genesis made her excuses and hurried to the elevator. She found Thomas pacing nervously near the edge of the roof, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "What's going on?" she asked, worry creeping into her voice. "Is everything okay?" Thomas took a deep breath before turning to face her. "Genesis, I can't do this anymore. The sneaking around, the lying, it's killing me." Genesis felt her stomach drop. "What are you saying? Do you want to break up?" "No!" Thomas exclaimed, reaching out to take her hands in his. "God, no, the exact opposite, actually. I want to go public with our relationship." Genesis's eyes widened in surprise. "But what about our jobs? We could both get fired if anyone found out." Thomas squeezed her hands gently. "I know it's a risk, but Jen, you're worth it. These past few weeks have been the happiest of my life. I don't want to hide how I feel about you anymore." Tears welled up in Genesis's eyes at his heartfelt words. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "But I'm scared, Thomas. What if it all goes wrong?" "Then we'll face it together," he said firmly. "I love you, Genesis. Whatever happens, we'll get through it as long as we have each other." Genesis's breath caught in her throat. It was the first time either of them had said those 3 little words. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if he never wanted to let go. As they stood there on the roof, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Genesis felt a sense of peace wash over her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they could overcome them together. The following Monday, Genesis and Thomas walked into the office hand in hand, ready to face whatever consequences awaited them. To their surprise, their co-workers were largely supportive of their relationship. Even their boss, after an initial lecture about professionalism, grudgingly agreed to let them continue working together as long as it didn't affect their job performance. As the months passed, Genesis and Thomas's relationship only grew stronger. They moved in together, blending their lives and creating a home filled with love and laughter. Genesis found herself dreaming of a future with Thomas, marriage, children, growing old together. But life had other plans. Just as everything seemed to be falling into place, Thomas received a job offer he couldn't refuse, a prestigious position with a top firm in London. It was his dream job, the opportunity of a lifetime, and it was halfway across the world from Genesis. "I won't take it," Thomas insisted, as they lay in bed one night, his arms wrapped tightly around Genesis. "I can't leave you." Genesis's heart ached at the thought of being separated from Thomas, and yet she knew she couldn't ask him to give up this chance. "You have to go," she said softly, fighting back tears. "This is what you've always wanted." They spent the next few weeks in a haze of bittersweet moments, trying to soak up every second together before Thomas's departure. Genesis helped him pack up his belongings, her chest tightening with each box she sealed. The night before Thomas was set to leave, they lay tangled together in bed, neither wanting to fall asleep and hasten the arrival of morning. "Come with me," Thomas whispered into the darkness. We could start a new life together in London. Genesis's heart leapt at the suggestion. How easy it would be to say yes, to follow Thomas across the ocean and never look back. But she thought of her own career, the life she'd built for herself in Chicago. Could she really give it all up? I can't, she said finally, her voice breaking. Not yet, at least. I need to see things through here. Thomas nodded, pulling her closer. I understand, but this isn't goodbye, Genesis. We'll make it work somehow. As dawn broke, Genesis drove Thomas to the airport, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. They clung to each other at the security checkpoint, neither wanting to let go. I love you, Thomas murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. We'll talk every day, I promise. Genesis nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched as Thomas disappeared through security, taking a piece of her heart with him. The first few months of long distance were brutal. Genesis threw herself into her work, trying to fill the Thomas-shaped hole in her life. They video chatted daily, but it wasn't the same as having him there beside her. As time passed, however, they settled into a new rhythm. Genesis found herself growing more independent, rediscovering old passions and exploring new ones. She and Thomas supported each other's dreams from afar, celebrating victories and offering comfort during setbacks. A year into their separation, Genesis received her own life-changing job offer, a chance to lead a new branch of her company opening in New York City. It wasn't London, but it was a step closer to Thomas and an incredible opportunity for her career. She accepted without hesitation, feeling for the first time that she was moving towards something rather than running away. Thomas was thrilled for her, his pride evident even through the pixelated screen of their video call. As Genesis packed up her Chicago apartment, she came across an old photo of her and Thomas from their early days of dating. She traced his smile with her finger, remembering the nervous excitement of those first few weeks together. Their love had changed since then, deepening and maturing as they faced the challenges of distance. Genesis no longer felt that desperate need to be with Thomas every second. Instead, their connection had evolved into something steadier, a calm certainty that they would find their way back to each other when the time was right. Genesis's first few months in New York flew by in a whirlwind of new experiences. She threw herself into her work, determined to prove herself in her new role. On weekends, she explored the city, falling in love with its energy and endless possibilities. Thomas visited whenever he could, stealing long weekends and holiday breaks to be together. Genesis treasured these moments, but found that she no longer felt incomplete without him by her side. The distance had given her a new perspective on their relationship and on herself. She had grown more confident, more independent, and more sure of who she was as an individual. One crisp autumn morning, Genesis received an unexpected email from Thomas. He had been offered a permanent position in London and wanted to discuss their future. Her heart raced as she read his words, a mixture of excitement and trepidation washing over her. I miss you, Jen, Thomas wrote. I know we've been making this long-distance thing work, but I can't help feeling like we're at a crossroads. I want you here with me, but I also know how much your career means to you. I think it's time we make a decision about our future together. Genesis sat back in her chair, her mind whirling with possibilities. She loved Thomas, there was no doubt about that. But the thought of uprooting her entire life and moving across the ocean filled her with uncertainty. She had worked hard to build her career in New York, and the idea of starting over in a new city was daunting. As she pondered her response, Genesis realized that this was about more than just logistics. It was about what she truly wanted for herself and for her relationship with Thomas. Did she see a future where they could both pursue their dreams without sacrificing their love for each other? With trembling fingers, Genesis began to type her reply. Thomas, I love you more than I can express in words. These past months apart have been challenging, but they've also shown me how strong we are together, even when we're physically apart. I've grown so much during this time, and I know you have too. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I don't want to make a hasty decision about our future. What we have is too important to risk on impulse. I think we need to have a serious conversation about what we both want and how we can make it work. Can you come to New York next month? I think it's time we see each other face to face and figure this out together." As she hit send, Genesis felt a sense of calm wash over her. She knew that whatever happened, she and Thomas would face it as a team. Their love had weathered distance and time, and she was confident it could withstand whatever challenges lay ahead. The weeks leading up to Thomas's visit flew by in a blur of anticipation and preparation. Genesis threw herself into her work, determined to prove herself worthy of the trust her company had placed in her. But in quiet moments, her mind would drift to Thomas and the looming conversation that would determine their future. Finally, the day of Thomas's arrival dawned. Genesis paced nervously in her apartment, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her dress and checking her reflection for the 100th time. When the doorbell rang, her heart leapt into her throat. She opened the door to find Thomas standing there, looking as handsome and nervous as she felt. For a moment, they just stared at each other, drinking in the sight of one another after so many months apart. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, they fell into each other's arms. "I missed you so much," Thomas murmured into her hair, holding her tightly. Genesis breathed in his familiar scent, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "I missed you too," she whispered. They spent the next few days reacquainting themselves with each other, exploring New York together and stealing quiet moments of intimacy. But both knew they couldn't avoid the serious conversation forever. On their last night together, they sat on Genesis's balcony, overlooking the twinkling lights of the city. Thomas took her hand, his expression serious. "Jen, I've been thinking a lot about us and our future," he began. "I love my job in London, but I love you more. If you're not ready to leave New York, I'll understand. I can look for opportunities here, or we can try long distance for a while longer until we figure something out." Genesis felt her heart swell with love for this man who was willing to sacrifice so much for her, but she knew she couldn't let him do that. "Thomas," she said softly, squeezing his hand, "I love you for offering that, but I can't let you give up your dream job for me. The truth is, I've been thinking about this too, a lot." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've decided to take a leap of faith. I want to move to London with you." Thomas's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you sure? What about your job here?" Genesis smiled. "I've already talked to my boss. They're willing to let me work remotely for a few months while I transition, and who knows? Maybe this is the push I needed to start that marketing consultancy I've always dreamed about." Thomas pulled her into a tight embrace, his joy palpable. "Genesis, you're amazing. I promise we'll make this work. Together." As they sealed their decision with a kiss, Genesis felt a sense of excitement and possibility wash over her. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Thomas by her side, she was ready to face whatever challenges came their way. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Genesis threw herself into preparing for the move, tying up loose ends at work and saying goodbye to friends and colleagues. There were moments of doubt and fear, but each time she spoke to Thomas, she felt reassured that she was making the right decision. Finally, the day of her departure arrived. As Genesis boarded the plane that would take her to her new life in London, she felt a mixture of sadness and exhilaration. She was leaving behind everything familiar, but she was also embarking on an exciting new chapter with the man she loved. When she stepped off the plane in London, Thomas was waiting for her with open arms. As they embraced, Genesis knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Their love had survived distance and uncertainty, and now it was time to build a future side by side. In the weeks that followed, Genesis and Thomas settled into their new life together. There were adjustments to be made, of course, navigating a new city, adapting to living together full-time after so long apart, and balancing their careers with their relationship. But through it all, their love only grew stronger. Genesis threw herself into exploring London, falling in love with its rich history and vibrant culture. She worked remotely for her New York company during the day and spent her evenings and weekends discovering hidden gems in the city with Thomas. As she had hoped, the move also gave her the push she needed to start her own marketing consultancy. With Thomas's encouragement, she began networking and building a client base. It was challenging work, but Genesis found it incredibly fulfilling. One evening, as they strolled hand in hand along the Thames, Thomas suddenly stopped and turned to face her. "Jen," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "these past few months with you have been the happiest of my life. I know we've been through a lot to get here, but I wouldn't change a thing. You are the most incredible, strong and loving woman I've ever known." Genesis felt her heart begin to race as Thomas dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "Genesis," he continued, his eyes shining with unshed tears, "will you marry me?" For a moment, Genesis was speechless. She looked at Thomas, the man who had been her colleague, her friend, her long-distance love, and now her partner in every sense of the word. In that instant, she saw their entire journey flash before her eyes. The stolen glances at the office, the secret kisses, the painful goodbyes, and the joyful reunions. With tears streaming down her face, Genesis nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." As Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a passionate kiss, Genesis felt a sense of completeness wash over her. Their love story had been far from conventional, filled with twists and turns, challenges and triumphs. But standing there in Thomas's arms, with the lights of London twinkling around them, Genesis knew that every step of their journey had led them exactly where they were meant to be. As they walked home that night, hands intertwined and hearts full of love and excitement for the future, Genesis reflected on how far they had come. From colleagues to friends, from lovers to partners, and now to fiancés. Their relationship had evolved in ways she never could have imagined when she first met Thomas in that Chicago office. She knew that marriage would bring its own set of challenges, but Genesis felt ready to face them head-on with Thomas by her side. They had already proven that their love could withstand distance, career changes, and the uncertainty of starting a new life in a foreign country. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. As they reached their apartment, Thomas pulled Genesis close once more. "I love you," he murmured, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "I love you too," Genesis replied, her heart full to bursting, always and forever. And as they stepped into their home, ready to begin the next chapter of their lives together, Genesis knew that this was just the beginning of their greatest adventure yet.